At the turn of the 20th century, a wave of Italian immigrants arrived on the shores of New York City, fleeing poverty and political unrest in their homeland. Among them were those who would go on to shape the future of organized crime in America, bringing with them a culture of secrecy, loyalty, and violence. In Sicily, where many of these immigrants originated, a secretive criminal society known as the Cosa Nostra had existed for centuries, rooted in a tradition of protecting local interests through force and intimidation. Giuseppe Morello, one of the most influential figures in the early days of the Mafia in America, had already begun to carve out a criminal empire even before the mass immigration. Morello's family was part of a network of Sicilian criminals who operated throughout New York's Little Italy, a densely packed neighborhood that became a hotbed for organized crime. As the immigrants settled into their new lives, they brought the traditions and customs of their homeland with them, blending them into the growing underworld of the United States. The first mafia bosses, such as Morello, capitalized on the immigrants' need for protection and guidance in a foreign land. Morello's early operations focused on extortion and small-scale racketeering, building a reputation as a man who could be trusted to handle disputes outside the law. By the early 1900s, New York's Italian-American community was growing rapidly, with thousands of newcomers settling into neighborhoods like Little Italy and East Harlem. The criminal organizations within these neighborhoods, often referred to as the Black Hand, became notorious for their violent tactics and willingness to settle disputes with force. Morello, who had established himself as one of the most powerful men in New York's Italian community, sought to unify the fragmented mafia factions under a single banner. In 1903, he orchestrated the infamous Morello War, a battle between rival mafia families for control over the city's most lucrative criminal enterprises. Giuseppe Morello's vision of a unified criminal empire was one that would later serve as the foundation for the mafia's dominance in America. His success in the Morello War solidified his position as one of the most powerful figures in New York's underworld, setting the stage for the formation of a true mafia syndicate. However, Morello's rise to power did not go unchallenged, as he faced competition from other ambitious criminal leaders, most notably Salvatore D'Aquila. D'Aquila, a ruthless and ambitious boss, sought to expand his influence in New York, leading to a series of bloody turf wars between the two factions. The struggle for dominance between Morello and D'Aquila would prove to be a defining moment in the early history of the American Mafia. As Morello continued to expand his empire, he realized that his hold on power was precarious without the loyalty of other powerful families in New York. By the 1910s, Morello began to form alliances with other mafia leaders, including those in New Jersey and Chicago, strengthening his position even further. Through his alliances and his reputation as a tough, pragmatic leader, Morello was able to consolidate power over a vast swath of the city's criminal activities. The Morello family, though initially fragmented, grew into one of the most powerful crime families in New York, dominating extortion, gambling, and bootlegging operations. As dawn broke over the small sun-kissed village of Corleone, Sicily, the streets were already bustling with activity. Children ran through the cobbled streets while elders gathered in the town square discussing news and the daily affairs of their tight-knit community. In this rural town, the roots of something far larger than anyone could imagine were beginning to take hold. Giuseppe Morello, born into a family steeped in the traditions of Sicily's criminal underworld, had watched the rise of organized crime as a young boy. His father, a well-known figure in Corleone, had been part of a small but growing network of criminals who operated under the shadow of the law. As Giuseppe grew older, he realized that this world of crime was not just an inheritance, but a potential path to power and wealth. By the time he reached his late teens, Giuseppe had already gained the respect of those around him, thanks to his sharp mind and ruthless ambition. Corleone, despite its idyllic setting, had long been a haven for criminal syndicates that used intimidation and extortion to control their affairs. Giuseppe became involved in the more secretive and dangerous aspects of the Sicilian Mafia, known as the Cosa Nostra. Though many considered the Mafia to be a purely Italian institution, its influence was beginning to spread beyond the shores of Sicily, across the Atlantic to the bustling streets of New York City. Giuseppe, like many others in his circle, saw opportunity in the chaotic streets of the United States, where the chance for power seemed limitless. In the early 1890s, Giuseppe made his move, joining a group of Sicilian immigrants headed to America, seeking both fortune and escape from the violent feuds that had marked his family's history. New York was a city of dreams for millions of immigrants, but for Giuseppe and others like him, it also presented the perfect environment for the Mafia to thrive. As he arrived in Manhattan, Giuseppe was struck by the towering buildings, the crowded streets, and the undeniable sense of ambition that seemed to hang in the air. Though he spoke little English, Giuseppe knew that he would find a way to make his mark in this new land. Within months he had connected with other members of the Sicilian underworld, forming alliances that would become crucial in the coming years. In these early days, Morello's network focused primarily on extortion, protection rackets, and the control of local businesses owned by fellow immigrants. Giuseppe's operations were small, but his ruthless efficiency quickly gained him a reputation within the community. As his influence grew, so did his criminal activities, and Morello began to set his sights on more lucrative opportunities, including the illegal sale of alcohol. Prohibition was just around the corner, and Giuseppe knew that the ban on alcohol could create a massive underground market, a market he was determined to dominate. Meanwhile, other Italian immigrant families in New York were also growing their influence. Families like the Genovese and Gambino were quietly taking their first steps towards what would eventually become the most powerful organized crime syndicates in the world. By the early 1900s, the Cosa Nostra had gained a strong foothold in New York, but the power struggle between different families had only just begun. Giuseppe Morello, ambitious and calculating, sought to position himself as one of the foremost leaders of the Mafia in America. His rise to power would not come without struggle, however, as rival families, like those led by the influential Salvatore Maranzano and others, looked to claim their own dominion. Giuseppe's journey into the heart of the Mafia was marked by bloodshed and betrayal, as his family fought for supremacy within the criminal underworld of New York City. Though his ambitions were clear, Morello also understood the importance of discretion. The American authorities were beginning to take notice of the rising tide of organized crime. Still, Giuseppe's focus was on building his empire. He worked tirelessly to extend his influence into the liquor trade and other illegal industries that would fuel his growing wealth. By 1910, the Morello crime family had become one of the most prominent forces in New York's underworld, but it was also under intense scrutiny by law enforcement. The Mafia's hold on New York was becoming stronger, but it was still fragile, vulnerable to internal strife and external threats. Despite these challenges, Giuseppe Morello continued to rise through the ranks, earning a reputation for his intelligence and unyielding will to succeed. His success, however, did not go unnoticed by others in the underworld, and soon competition would come from both new and established enemies. Giuseppe knew that to remain on top he would have to forge alliances, eliminate rivals, and continue to innovate within the world of organized crime. Little did he know the stage was being set for the transformation of the Mafia, from a series of rival factions into a more unified, powerful criminal syndicate that would dominate America for decades to come. By 1915, the power dynamics of New York's Mafia were beginning to shift as Giuseppe Morello solidified his position within the criminal elite. Morello, who had once been a relative outsider, now controlled vast swathes of New York's criminal operations from extortion to bootlegging, and he had begun to forge ties with influential political figures. However, the rise of more powerful and ruthless figures in the underworld would soon challenge Morello's control over the city. Salvatore Maranzano, another Sicilian immigrant, had ambitions to unite the fragmented crime families into a single all-powerful mafia organization, and he soon became Morello's fiercest rival. As Maranzano's influence grew, tensions between the two men escalated, and a violent power struggle began to emerge. Morello, ever the strategist, knew that he had to act quickly or risk losing everything he had built in New York's criminal world. In the midst of this growing conflict, the entire Mafia network in New York found itself embroiled in a series of bloody gang wars as factions battled for supremacy. Giuseppe realized that in order to maintain control he would have to consolidate his power, eliminate threats, and quickly make alliances with those who could protect his interests. One of the key elements of this strategy was his ability to manipulate the city's political landscape, using bribes and influence to ensure that the police and public officials turned a blind eye to his criminal activities. Despite his best efforts, however, the pressure from Maranzano and other rival families mounted, leading to an inevitable showdown between the Mafia's most powerful leaders. Morello's power was shaken by Maranzano's growing influence, and soon a war between the two men's factions broke out in full force. In the midst of this bloody conflict, Morello was arrested on charges of conspiracy, though many believed the charges were politically motivated in an effort to weaken his position in the Mafia war. While behind bars, Morello's family continued to fight on his behalf, attempting to maintain control of their territory even in his absence. However, this period of incarceration would mark the beginning of a dramatic shift in the balance of power within the Mafia. Maranzano, capitalizing on Morello's troubles, began consolidating power across New York, and his vision for a unified Mafia under his rule was slowly taking shape. As Maranzano's power grew, so did his ambition. He soon declared himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, leading to a fundamental shift in how the Mafia operated in America. Yet while Maranzano's rule seemed secure, Morello's influence never fully dissipated. The Morello family, though fractured, still had loyal allies in key positions throughout New York. As the war between the two factions escalated, a new figure began to emerge on the horizon of the mafia world, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano, known for his sharp mind and ruthless efficiency, had long been an ally of Maranzano, but as tensions escalated, he began to see the cracks in Maranzano's leadership. Luciano, a strategic thinker, recognized that the future of the mafia lay in a more organized and less chaotic structure, where power could be distributed more evenly among the families. By the late 1920s, Luciano began to maneuver behind the scenes, slowly undermining Maranzano's authority and positioning himself as a leader who could unite the fractured mafia under a single banner. Maranzano, ever the paranoid ruler, soon caught wind of Luciano's plotting and moved to eliminate him, ordering a hit on the young upstart. However, Luciano was not easily eliminated. In a daring move, Luciano struck first, orchestrating the murder of Maranzano in 1931, solidifying his control over the mafia. With Maranzano dead, Luciano took control of New York's mafia and restructured the organization to create a more efficient and less overtly violent operation. Luciano's vision for the future of the mafia was clear. He would create a national network of crime families working together under a shared leadership that would ensure greater profits and power for all involved. Through his efforts, Luciano transformed the mafia from a series of warring factions into a more sophisticated, organized criminal syndicate that operated with precision and secrecy. Luciano's restructuring of the mafia would become the blueprint for organized crime in the United States for decades to come, forever altering the course of criminal history in America. His reign marked the beginning of a new era for the mafia, one that would be defined by its ability to infiltrate and control legitimate businesses, as well as its ability to corrupt and manipulate political structures. Under Luciano's leadership, the mafia continued to grow, expanding its operations into new areas such as gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering. His influence stretched across the United States, with key families in Chicago, Detroit, and even Los Angeles all answering to his leadership. The mafia's newfound power and organization enabled it to conduct its business with far more sophistication, often hiding behind legitimate front businesses and maintaining a low profile to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. Despite Luciano's success, however, the rise of the mafia was not without its challenges. New York's law enforcement, though corrupt, had started to take more aggressive action against organized crime, and in the 1930s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, began to make the mafia one of its top priorities. Under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI began a series of investigations aimed at dismantling the powerful criminal syndicates that had taken root across the country. However, Hoover's efforts were often frustrated by the mafia's ability to bribe and corrupt public officials, making it difficult for the FBI to make significant headway in their investigations. Despite this, the FBI's focus on organized crime would eventually lead to the implementation of new laws and methods that would prove crucial in the eventual downfall of many mafia leaders. By the 1940s, Luciano's reign was beginning to show signs of wear, as rivalries among the various mafia families resurfaced and tensions mounted. In particular, tensions between the Sicilian factions and the American-born members of the mafia were beginning to boil over, with many younger, more ambitious members seeking to challenge the old guard. These internal divisions would eventually lead to a power struggle that threatened to undo the unified mafia Luciano had worked so hard to build. One of the most significant moments in this struggle came in 1946 when Luciano was deported to Italy after spending several years in prison for his involvement in organized crime. Luciano's deportation to Sicily marked the beginning of a period of instability within the American Mafia, as many of the families began to splinter and fight for control of key territories. Though Luciano no longer had direct control over the American Mafia, his legacy lived on, as his ideas and structure continued to influence the next generation of Mafia leaders. Even as Luciano settled into his life in Sicily, he remained an influential figure in the world of organized crime, often using his connections to manipulate events from afar. While Luciano's absence left a void in the leadership of the American Mafia, his successors, such as Vito Genovese and others, attempted to fill the gap and maintain the power structure he had put in place. However, as the years passed, the Mafia would face new challenges from law enforcement as well as from within, as younger leaders began to challenge the old guard. Though the Mafia had lost some of its luster in the post-World War II era, it remained a force to be reckoned with its tentacles reaching into nearly every aspect of American life. In the 1950s, the Mafia's power was tested in a new way, as public awareness of its existence began to rise, largely due to the efforts of journalists, FBI agents, and whistleblowers from within the Mafia itself. Through a combination of investigative journalism and undercover law enforcement work, the Mafia's operations began to unravel, with key figures facing arrest and conviction. However, the Mafia proved remarkably resilient. Even as major figures were incarcerated, new leaders emerged and the organization adapted to the changing landscape of criminal activity. The Sicilian American Mafia, which had once been a collection of disparate competing factions, had by now transformed into a more organized and sophisticated criminal syndicate capable of exerting influence in virtually every corner of society. As the years went on, the Mafia became embroiled in new areas of criminal activity, such as the booming drug trade, and continued to exploit its power in the labor unions, politicians, and law enforcement. Though the Mafia had suffered setbacks over the decades, it had also adapted to the new world it inhabited, and its ability to survive in the face of mounting challenges proved its resilience and ruthlessness. By the late 20th century, the Mafia had been brought to its knees by a combination of law enforcement efforts, societal changes, and internal divisions. While its reign was far from over, the once dominant force that had shaped organized crime in America was now a shadow of its former self. The story of the American Mafia, from its humble beginnings in the rural streets of Sicily to its rise and eventual decline in the United States, remains one of the most fascinating and complex tales in the history of organized crime. As the 21st century approached, the influence of the Mafia began to wane, though it never fully disappeared from the shadows of American society. Despite efforts by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to dismantle the criminal networks, Mafia families continued to operate in key cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Their power was no longer what it once was, but their grip on illegal activities such as gambling, loan sharking, and drug trafficking remained. The once mighty families of the Mafia had been deeply affected by the changing political and economic landscape of the late 20th century. Rising legal battles, shrinking profits from traditional rackets, and internal betrayals weakened the Mafia's iron grip on American crime. In particular, the advent of technology, the rise of cybercrime, and the internationalization of criminal enterprises posed new challenges that the traditional Mafia was not equipped to handle. Young bloods in the Mafia who had grown up in a world of street-level crime were now forced to adapt or perish in the face of new, globalized methods of crime. At the same time, law enforcement, empowered by new surveillance techniques and the widespread use of informants, continued its relentless pursuit of the Mafia. In the years that followed, some of the most powerful Mafia bosses were convicted and imprisoned, including figures like John Gotti, who had briefly attempted to resurrect the Mafia's former glory. However, despite the arrests and convictions, the Mafia still had its tentacles in various corners of American society, especially in areas where corruption and crime were deeply embedded. One of the most significant blows to the Mafia came in the 1990s, when the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, a RICO Act, allowed for more effective prosecution of Mafia bosses and their families. The RICO Act proved instrumental in targeting the structure of organized crime, making it easier for law enforcement to take down entire Mafia families, rather than just individual members. By the early 2000s, many of the old Mafia families had been dismantled, and many former leaders had either been incarcerated or killed. However, the legacy of the Mafia remained. In many ways, the American Mafia had laid the foundation for modern organized crime in the United States. The tactics and methods it pioneered, ranging from bribery to money laundering, had been adopted by other criminal organizations, both domestic and international. The story of the Mafia, from its beginnings in Sicily to its rise to power in the United States and ultimately to its slow decline, reflects both the dangers and the allure of organized crime. Giuseppe Morello's journey, from a young Sicilian immigrant with dreams of wealth and power to one of the most influential Mafia bosses in America, set the stage for the empire that would eventually dominate American crime. Morello's legacy, though fraught with violence and criminality, was foundational in shaping the Mafia's dominance over the years. Though Luciano no longer had direct control over the American Mafia, his legacy lived on, as his ideas and structure continued to influence the next generation of Mafia leaders. The rise of the Mafia in America has been immortalized in countless books, movies, and documentaries, becoming a symbol of both the promise and the perils of the American dream. Today, the Mafia may not hold the same power it once did, but its legacy persists in the culture and history of organized crime in the United States. While law enforcement agencies have significantly weakened its hold on the criminal world, the American Mafia's rise to power remains one of the most remarkable stories of crime, ambition, and survival in modern history. From the back alleys of Sicily to the skyscrapers of New York, the story of the American Mafia is a tale of power, betrayal, and the pursuit of wealth at any cost. Though the Mafia may never fully disappear, its place in history is secure as one of the most influential criminal organizations to ever exist in the United States.